Hello and welcome to Western Civ. I've got a wonderful author interview for you here today. I'm sitting down with historian Nic Morton. We're going to be talking about everyone's favorite topic, the Crusades. Crusader warfare, Crusader states, misconceptions about the Crusades, everything that matters. Because his book, The Crusader States and Their Neighbors, A Military History, is actually out on paperback right now. I've got a link to it in the show notes if you'd like to pick it up. It's an excellent coverage. But I also think this topic is just really pertinent right now because we're going through another period of what seems to be endemic conflict in the Middle East. And as I mentioned in the interview, people always seem to want to hearken back to the Crusades as some sort of grandfather of all of the problems that come out of the Middle East. And there's so many issues with doing that. And so I think it's relevant to have this conversation again. And also it's important and it's interesting. And who doesn't like talking about the assassins and the Crusader states and the Leper King and all of that? I mean, there's just so many cool names from the Crusades. Am I right? So without further ado, let's get to the interview. All right, welcome back. As I mentioned moments ago, I'm sitting down with historian Nic Bunker. We're going to be talking about his latest book, In the Shadow of Fear, America and the World in 1950. As someone who teaches this period of history every single year, I found the book to be particularly interesting. You start the book in Labor Day, 1949. I'm kind of interested in that date because I found the beginning of the book fascinating in a lot of ways. And I was hoping you could explain to those who are listening, why did you choose to start the book there? And how is that in so many ways the perfect starting point for the historical narrative that follows?
Well, Adam, thank you very much for having me on the podcast. Well, this is my fourth book, and what I always do in my books is I try to start with a very visual picture of what I'm talking about, a kind of cinematic presentation of the events and the issues. And Labor Day, September 5th, 1949, is ideal for that, because Labor Day is always a day with a great deal going on in the United States. Baseball, marches in those days, heyday of the labor unions, marches by labor unions in Detroit and so on, all kinds of other events, rodeos, new films being released. So it's an opportunity to present a kind of portrait of America at that moment, not taken at random, but with a view to kind of displaying all the kind of forces at work. But the other thing is that September 1949 is a very interesting moment, partly because of things that were happening overseas. For example, Great Britain was going through one of its economic crises, one of its many economic crises, and looking for help from the United States. In addition to that, the Soviets had just tested their first atomic bomb on August the 29th, 1949, just a few days earlier. And that's an important moment too, which I think we'll discuss later on. But also for Harry Truman, it was an important day. Now, Harry Truman's situation at the moment was this. Now, he was 65 years old, but still a man who retained all his energy and his enthusiasm and his idealism. And of course, he'd won a great victory in the presidential election the year before in 1948. But by the time it got to September 1949, he was in a bit of difficulty. Now, Truman's popularity had always swung up and down quite wildly. If you look at a chart of his popularity ratings right throughout his presidency from 1945 to 52, you'll see his popularity ratings swinging up wildly up and down. Now, the problem he had in 1949 was partly to do with the economy, which was always a problem for Truman. First half of 1949, there was a recession. 5 million unemployed. The recession had probably more or less ended by September, but people weren't sure of that yet. That had contributed to a fall in his popularity ratings. In addition, he was having a lot of trouble with Congress. Now, technically speaking, the Democratic Party, Truman's party, controlled both houses of Congress, but in fact, they were being very difficult, very obstructive towards his legislative agenda. Now, Truman had come back into office at the beginning of 1949 with a very ambitious program of liberal reforms known as the Fair Deal, but Congress were essentially refusing to enact all but a handful of his measures. And so Labor Day, September 5th, 1949, Truman decides to kind of relaunch himself. And he gave two big speeches, one in Pittsburgh and one in Des Moines, Iowa, which were intended to kind of really mount a kind of rousing defense of his program. And obviously those places were chosen for very good reasons. Pittsburgh, because of course it's the capital of the steel industry and kind of one of the heartlands of the labor unions. And Des Moines, Iowa, because of course it's the Corn Belt. And that was where you found farmers. And labor and farmers were the people that Truman saw as the heart of his electoral coalition. And so Labor Day, September 5th, he goes to those two places to try and make sure that he's fully on top of that situation and try to rally their support behind him for a new push for his legislative agenda.
But it's almost interesting if we look at this part of the book. Truman seems to fail to understand the way that America is changing in 1949 as we're sort of transitioning away from, the New Deal and FDR and his liberal revolution and into a sort of new America. And one of the things that I think is always interesting to show people is the electoral maps from these times, because as you look, you'll notice a lot of states that are we say red and blue in America. A lot of states that are red here are blue then, right? And so you have this sort of, I don't want to say maybe an uneasy alliance between sort of Dixiecrat, Southern Democrats, and then other Labor Party individuals throughout sort of what we would call the Rust Belt here today. And so I wanted to ask, is 1949 sort of the beginning of the end of this sort of FDR period, this New Deal period, when labor is sort of at its height, and we see this sort of growth in liberalism in America? Is this sort of high tide and it's kind of downhill for Truman from here?
Well, there's some truth in that. Now, with regard to the New Deal, now the New Deal institutions and the creations of the New Deal were still in place, and they would remain in place for a very long time. Social Security, which Roosevelt had created in 1935, that was still in place, and in fact, it was a system that was still developing and growing. The federal agencies that Roosevelt had created, the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Food and Drug Administration, they were still in place. They weren't going to disappear. So a lot of the achievements of the New Deal were definitely there. It was a kind of a permanent change in the way that America functioned. But there was a sense, yes, in which the kind of energy and the drive and the enthusiasm of Roosevelt's period had already come to an end. It was possible to argue, in fact, that the Democratic Party was really quite an old man's party by this stage. It's quite striking when you look at the leading figures in the Democratic Party at this period in Congress, for example, how they tend to be a much older generation, and that was actually true of Truman himself. There was a new breed of insurgent Republicans, so they were young men. The most famous or the most notorious is obviously Senator Joseph McCarthy. He was only in his early 40s. There were other people too, though. Richard Nixon, who was only 37, and he was now a rising star. Barry Goldwater, for example. Now, Barry Goldwater, not yet in national politics, but he won his first seat on the Phoenix City Council in Phoenix, Arizona in November 1949. So there was a sense, yes, in which the liberal tide had kind of peaked, and there was an opportunity for the Republicans, if you like, to reinvent themselves. And I think that was what was actually occurring.
That's interesting. And, one of the things that we have to also keep in mind is that, none of this happens in a bubble, because the United States is still operating in a world that's emerging from the destruction of the Second World War, and in Europe, particularly in Western Europe, America is trying to sell Western Europe on this idea of an economic and political system that's supposed to, keep Western Europe in the American orbit going forward. And you talk about two gentlemen in particular, Benjamin Franklin Fairless and Philip Murray, as people who are trying to make this happen. And in what ways were those two gentlemen, and I like the way that you focus on them in the book, sort of an excellent microcosm of the future that America had in mind for its Western European allies?
These two characters that you mentioned, Benjamin Fairless and Phil Murray, are completely forgotten today. But if you had been making a list in 1949 of the 20 or 30 most powerful people in America, you would have put those two men on the list. But this is often the case. Some of the most powerful and interesting people in any given period just become forgotten in years to come. Now, Benjamin Fairless was the president and chief executive of U.S. Steel. And U.S. Steel at the time was a huge company. It still exists today, of course, under a different name, but US Steel was a huge company. It wasn't just the biggest steel company in America. It actually produced more steel than the entirety of France and West Germany combined. And that was the company that Fairless led. Now, on the other side of the industrial divide was Phil Murray. Now, Phil Murray wasn't actually American. He was a Scotsman. He was a Scotsman who had emigrated with his father to America when Phil Murray was in his teens. He was a coal miner. First went down the pit in Scotland when he was 10 years old. And at this point, he was the president of the United Steelworkers, and he was also the president of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which was a huge kind of umbrella organization for many labor unions and still exists today as part of the AFL-CIO. So here were these two characters on either side of the industrial divide. And in fact, at this moment, they were kind of locked in a dispute. They were locked in a big dispute within the steel industry between management and the unions, essentially because the unions wanted pensions and health care benefits post-retirement, and the management didn't want to give them to them. So here are these two men. But the curious thing is that although they were on opposite sides of the divide, these two powerful characters, they actually were very similar in many ways. Both of them were men who had risen from the bottom. And that's, again, something interesting, that when you look at corporate managers in American companies in the 40s and 50s, you'll often find they were people who came from very humble circumstances, often didn't even have a college degree. Now, Benjamin Fairless, son of a coal miner from Ohio, he had got his start in this industry as a construction worker building a steel mill. And then he rose by diligence and flair and so on to get to the top of the company. Murray, as I said, went down the pit in Scotland at 10 years old. Again, he had risen from the bottom. But the two men had not only their social mobility in common, but also their kind of confidence and vision of the future. You see, both of them really believed in what they thought was being the kind of the American industrial system, which involved very big companies investing very heavily in new plant and equipment, continually investing in mechanization, automation, applying science and technology, operating on a very big scale and achieving high productivity and high wages. And both Murray and Fairless, in their different ways, believed that this system could end up producing an ever-improving standard of living for both the shareholders of the company and for the workers, and the corporate managers would be happy too. That was their kind of vision of the American industrial system. Although, as I say, they were on different sides of the divide in this particular dispute. Now, the relevance of that to what was going on in Europe is simply this. Now, this was the period when the Marshall Plan was at its peak. I mean, the Marshall Plan had been launched in 1947. By the end of 1949, it was really getting well into its stride in Europe. And of course, the Marshall Plan was a huge economic and financial measure for the United States to help rebuild the kind of shattered economies of Western Europe. Not just the shattered one, was also Great Britain too, because Great Britain received actually the largest share of the aid. Now, the Marshall Plan wasn't just about money, although that was very important. It was important about money because they were giving Europe dollars, which Europe could use then to buy products from America. That was really one of the goals of it. But it was also kind of a philosophical thing. What they were trying to do, they were trying to take the American industrial model, which Murray and Fairless believed in, and export it to Europe. They were kind of wanting to turn Europe into something like the United States. In other words, a huge single market. And by the way, that's an issue, the European single market, which has been a very big political issue here in the UK in the last 5 years or so. They wanted to turn Europe into a huge single market with no barriers between the countries, with trade flowing freely, so that in Europe, companies and individuals could achieve the kind of standards of productivity and the kind of standard of living that America already had. And there was a political issue aside to this, of course. Partly it was a way of ensuring that Western Europe remained stalwart against the Soviet Union, but also it was a way of trying to prevent the recurrence of what had occurred during the 1930s. There was an enormous amount of looking back to the 1930s, this period. Politicians, thinkers of all kinds, were always looking back at the 1930s and saying, how can we ensure that we don't see the terrible things that happened in the 1930s happen again? How can we ensure that Europe does not veer towards extremist politics, whether fascism or communism? And by creating a kind of American-style economy in Europe, they believed they could do that because the countries of Europe wouldn't want to fight each other if they were trading with each other and achieving an American kind of standard of living.
Yeah, that's so interesting, and I think it's interesting because I still think it's to an extent true today. When you talk to individuals, there's still so much retrospective thinking about the 1930s, and when you talk about the fear of history repeating itself, what the example that constantly comes up is the rise of Hitler and fascism in history, and it's just it's being transposed over and over and over again. When we talk about things like appeasement is the word that always comes up. Well, we can't ever appease a dictator because of what happened in the 1930s. So if we do this again, then this dictator is going to ask for more and more and more, and we're going to have another world war. That's what's going to happen. And it's fascinating the way that was happening constantly in the 1950s and still happens today to a large extent, especially in the United States, I'll say, for my part. But there is, and I like the use of the word shadow in the book on the cover, because there is, of course, this huge shadow that's looming over everything in the United States. And that is not the potential resurrection of Nazi Germany. That is the Soviet Union. Everything as we enter what we call the Cold War is going to be focused around this competition with the Soviet Union. So I think it is important to set the stage. And if we're starting in 1949 with the Soviet Union still under the control of a aging Joseph Stalin, rapidly aging Joseph Stalin, but what was that like? Where were they at that point as we're looking at 1949?
Well, first of all, I entirely agree with you about the way people still look back to the 1930s continually. I mean, whenever people are discussing any aspect of foreign policy and national security at the moment, whether it be to do with Ukraine or many other issues, they'll frequently return to the issue of appeasement and the rise of dictators. I mean, I think maybe a president ought to sign an executive order, maybe banning anybody from talking about the Munich crisis, because it doesn't necessarily help. My feeling is that the much more relevant period is the one I talk about in this book, which is the late 40s and early 50s. Now, in terms of where the Soviet Union was in 1949, as you say, Stalin was approaching his 70th birthday. Not in good shape physically, of course, Stalin, a heavy smoker, heavy drinker, all kinds of health problems, which would eventually kill him in 1953, but still exceptionally effective as a politician. Now, Russia itself was in economically not the best place in the world. Of course, they had suffered tremendous losses of human beings and of capital and of buildings and so on during World War II. There had been a famine starting in 1946. That had lasted a couple of years. Hardly surprising because, of course, they'd lost such a huge chunk of their male labor force on the land. They'd been unable to invest in the productivity of the land, and Stalin hadn't helped with his policies towards Soviet agriculture. So Soviet Union could barely feed itself. They were also trying to maintain an enormous war machine. They were spending something like 15% or more of the economy on war production to maintain their huge army in Eastern Europe and to build aircraft, ships, and so on. And that was putting a huge strain on the Soviet economy. In addition to that, Stalin at that time was revisiting some of the tactics he'd used in the 1930s. Now, the 1930s had been the year of the so-called Great Terror. Between 1936 and 1939. Show trials, purges, the creation of the huge labor camps of the Gulag, and all very public, actually. The West was fully aware of what was going on in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. Now, 1949, 1950 was the period of what was known as Stalin's Little Terror. And this was much less known about in the West because it wasn't sort of secret, but Stalin didn't hold show trials, for example. And the Little Terror involved a series of purges of parts of the Communist Party, purges of intellectuals, particularly Jewish intellectuals, all intended to allow Stalin to continue to maintain his extremely firm grip on the country. For example, there was a thing called the Leningrad Affair. He essentially purged the entire Communist Party in Leningrad. No one in the West really knew anything about this, but it was a great issue in the Soviet Union at the time. Full details didn't really become available until the 1980s and the 1990s when the Soviet Union collapsed. But that was really what Stalin was up to. In addition to that, though, there was something very ominous going on, which was not only did he now have the atom bomb, but also the Soviet press and Soviet statesmen were making speeches and coming out with writings which was starting to hint at something involving Asia. They were starting to hint at the fact that they wanted to see an armed struggle in Asia, an armed struggle against what they called Western imperialism. That armed struggle was already starting to some extent. There was an armed insurgency in Malaya. There was the situation in Vietnam, of course, where the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, were fighting against the French. And there were hints in other places, too, of this kind of armed struggle. So the Soviet Union was, I say, economically still weak, but very firmly under the grip of Stalin. And there were suggestions, there were hints that they were turning their attention more and more towards the east, towards Asia.
Yeah, and I think there's two really important points here to sort of keep in mind. And I like in the book how you do talk about the Soviet Union in terms of its domestic issues and not just its international outlook. And the reason for that is, particularly, I think, in the United States, I suppose that's the only country I can speak of in this regard, we have a tendency to assume that everyone else in every other country in the world is just hyper-focused on us, the United States. Everything is about us, and that everything that the Soviet Union was doing was geared towards the United States, when in reality, many countries, I suppose you would say China's the example today, are just as interested in domestic issues and other issues going on. The other point that I think is important is, and even if you look in the 1950s, and again, if you want to talk about what's an important period of history for politicians to be aware of today, we have this tendency in the United States to really play up the strengths of whatever our chief adversary is at the moment and downplay the weaknesses, when in reality, the Soviet Union was weak economically coming out of the Second World War. That's something that, you don't see, a lot of discussions of, which is an important thing to keep in mind. But sort of moving on here, one of those real strengths of this book that I really enjoy is that you do talk about a lot of the important figures who aren't just the people who you would see if you picked up a United States textbook. Okay. It's not all about Truman. It's not all about Joseph McCarthy later on. In fact, in chapter 1, you write Dean Acheson, and I'm not sure if I got that right, was the right person at the right time. And I found him to be a fascinating character. So I was hoping you could tell the listeners, who was Dean Acheson and how did his formative years prepare him for what he was going to do? And why is he such an important figure at this period in history?
Acheson, he was Secretary of State under Harry Truman at this point. He'd remained Secretary of State until the end of the Truman administration at the end of 1952. 1949, he was 56 years old, and he was a very capable, competent individual. I mean, he was a graduate of both of Yale and Harvard Law School. Very experienced lawyer, very experienced government official in a number of different roles. Now, as a lawyer, what had happened was that after he left Harvard Law School, he had become a clerk to the Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, who was also, as it happens to be, was also quite a great friend of Harry Truman. And working for Brandeis, Acheson had really picked up two things. First of all, he'd picked up the same kind of democratic politics as Brandeis and Wilson had. That was important because Acheson and Truman really became very, very good friends. They were very, very firm allies, really both believed in each other. But also, what Acheson had done is he'd mastered a kind of a technique of how to be a lawyer, which really stood him in good stead. Working for Brandeis at the Supreme Court, what Acheson was doing was he was given very complicated cases with a lot of facts involved, especially cases to do with labor relations or labor law, which is something that Acheson was preoccupied with. And what Acheson learned how to do was how to take an extremely complicated factual situation, get to the essentials of it, draw out the basic principles, and then come out with a definite course of action. In the case of working for the Supreme Court Justice, he was helping to draft the opinion in a particular Supreme Court case. But later on, it helped him in his negotiating style. And Acheson really became an excellent negotiator. Now, he had also worked in the U.S. Treasury Department in the early 1930s, where he kind of fell out with Franklin Roosevelt. The two men didn't really like each other. And then he worked in the State Department. And again, he'd worked, particularly during World War II, he'd worked on big economic issues. I mean, he was essentially one of the masterminds of the famous Bretton Woods Agreement for managing the international currency system, which to some extent was divided way into the 1970s. So that's the kind of man he was. He didn't see himself as a great thinker about geopolitics. He didn't see himself as particularly original in that line. But he was firmly committed to belief in the Western alliance, first of all against Adolf Hitler, then against the Soviet Union. And also he was exceptionally good at taking political policy ideas and getting them into practice. One of his big achievements in 1949 was the creation of West Germany, what became the Federal Republic of West Germany. That had to be created out of what had existed before, which was the division of West Germany into occupation zones, Britain, France, and the United States. And he essentially got into place the mechanism for turning West Germany actually into a new federal republic, and they had their first election in the fall of 1949. And that was a really big deal. The problem, of course, was that although that was a very big achievement by Acheson, creating the Federal Republic of West Germany wasn't really something that really resonated with an American audience at home. And so Acheson always had this problem that although he was very popular with the president, although he was exceptionally popular and competent, he didn't really have a strong domestic following at home in the United States of America. And that would come to some extent to be his undoing.
Well, that's interesting. And now we've talked about the United States, we've talked about the Soviet Union, we've talked a little bit about Great Britain, but Great Britain has a major role to play throughout the late 1940s, early and throughout the 1950s in terms of the international scene, and particularly what's going to happen in Western Europe. And I think it's worth pointing out that Great Britain wins 2 world wars. They're on the winning side of 2 world wars, and yet they come out of it losing their empire and with essentially a shattered economy, which is, winning a war isn't quite the boondoggle, I suppose, that it once was, I guess, is the message to come out of those 2 things. But I thought, let's set the stage as well. Like, how did Great Britain stand in 1949, particularly its economy, and how did that play into America's international plans?
Well, Adam, I have to say, you're being a little unfair to us British there, actually, because it wasn't quite as simple as that. Britain hadn't yet lost its empire. It was in the process of losing it. Now, they had definitely lost one big chunk of the empire, which was the Indian subcontinent, when India and Pakistan became independent in August 1947. That had gone. But the rest of it was still pretty much intact. The way the British saw it was that they were not losing their empire, they were transforming into something new. A British Commonwealth. And the key character here was a man called Ernest Bevin, who was the British Foreign Secretary, who, in other words, he was the equivalent in Britain of Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State in the United States. And Bevin, of course, was a socialist. He had been a Labour Union leader himself for a long time. He was a member of the British Labour government. But he wanted to turn the British Empire into a Commonwealth, a voluntary association of independent states. His intention was over time they would all become independent. A voluntary association of independent states which would stand together and cooperate, and it would cooperate economically. And that was very important to the British because the British did, to some degree, in fact, to a large degree, depend on certain parts of the empire, particularly West Africa and Malaysia, and in other parts too. But those were really 2 of the most important. So it was going to be economically cooperating with each other. It was going to be a military alliance. It was also going to be an alliance that was stout against the Soviets. And it was going to be an alliance of countries, voluntary association of countries, who would be committed to democracy, the rule of law, all the things the British thought that they had given to the empire. And it was going to be important for another reason, which was geopolitically, because, of course, the British Empire, or the British Commonwealth it now was, included all these really important strategic locations. Straits of Gibraltar, for example, controlling the entrance of the Mediterranean. Suez Canal, controlling the other end of the Mediterranean and providing the route not only to India, but also to something that was becoming more and more important at this moment, which was the oil wells of Iraq and Iran. Those were becoming really, really crucial to British foreign policy. 2 or 3 years later, they started to become really crucial to American foreign policy too. That was just starting at this period. But also, of course, Singapore, for example. Just look at a map, you see why Singapore is so important. So the British Empire turning itself into this British Commonwealth, hoping to sort of hold together in some way or other, and also maintaining control of all these great strategic choke points. Now, this then changed sometime later. From about 1955-56 onwards, the British actually really did begin to seriously dismantle the empire. But in 1949-1950, they really thought that they could actually hold it together.
Well, that's interesting. It's more of a transition at this point. The next part that I wanted to ask about is that we rarely talk about senators in U.S. history, which is a little bit remarkable, given how important of an institution that actually is. But again, if you open a U.S. history textbook, by beginning to end, you could probably count on two hands the number of times that a senator is actually named. You talk about Walter George, and I found him to be particularly interesting. Like, why was Walter George so important? And particularly, how does he represent the changing nature of the Democratic Party after the Second World War? And then how the changing nature of that party will impact Truman's agenda?
Well, I totally agree. In America, there is a tendency to neglect Congress by historians. Historians spend an enormous amount of time on presidential history. They like to grade presidents out of 10 and put them in kind of order of who was the greatest president, who was the worst president. And congressmen and senators simply often get forgotten. And I'm rather different. Personally, I think Congress is actually the most fascinating part of the American system, because Congress is the place where a lot of powerful characters collide with each other. And they collide with each other in these debates that are actually really very important. Everything, for example, in America, in one way or another, every issue America is grappling with always ends up in the federal budget. And Congress is the place where the federal budget gets taken to pieces, dissected, put back together, or sometimes they really can't reach any agreement at all, which is obviously what's happening at the moment, at this moment in 2023. So I find Congressmen fascinating. Now, you mentioned Walter George. Now, Senator Walter George, again, completely forgotten figure now. But if I could give you a kind of modern equivalent, you have a senator at the moment in the United States who's sort of the equivalent, and that's Joe Manchin. Joe Manchin in the Democratic Party now is not unlike Walter George in those days. Manchin is more famous. He's more of a household name. Walter George wasn't so much of a household name, but still sort of same sort of situation. A Democrat, but a conservative Democrat, a skeptical Democrat, and a bit of an awkward Democrat where the president's concerned. In Manchin's case, President Biden, and in the case of Walter George, it was Harry Truman. Now, Walter George was quite an old man by now. He was in his 70s. He'd actually been in the Senate since 1922 as the senior senator for Georgia. And of course, that meant actually he often didn't have to fight elections, because in Georgia at the time, Georgia was so Democratic that very often the Republicans didn't even put up candidates, whether for Congress or for the Senate. There really was absolutely no prospect of victory. And of course, that's a very different scenario now. So he was senior senator for Georgia and fiscal conservative, and very powerful because he was the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee in the late 1940s, and he'd been that since 1941. Later, he would get even more powerful in the 1950s when he was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Walter George became an essential ally of Dwight D. Eisenhower. The relationship between Eisenhower and Walter George became very important indeed in the middle period of the 1950s. Anyway, in 1949, Walter George was in his heyday, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, and causing all sorts of problems for Harry Truman. Basically, the problem was that George, being a fiscal conservative, was trying to hold Harry Truman to the goal of a balanced budget, which really wasn't achievable, which meant that Walter George was imposing all kinds of limitations on what Truman could do, particularly, for example, with the military budget. They were holding down the military budget. In addition to that, Walter George was skeptical about NATO. Now, it's a very interesting point, this, because today, we're used to thinking of NATO as this great organization that has been there for 70 years or so. And we like to think that it's always something that's commanded a great deal of support and that it came into being kind of triumphantly in 1949. But there were a great many skeptics about NATO in these early years, including Walter George, as were Republicans. The problem with NATO at the time was that NATO was like a great big donut with a hole in the middle. And the hole in the middle was Germany, because at this point, the French refused to allow West Germany to rearm. The British weren't very happy either about West Germany rearming, but the French were absolutely, they would not hear a word of it, for obvious reasons, because they'd fought 3 wars with Germany in the preceding 80 years. If you didn't have Germany in NATO, and if you didn't have all the Western powers, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Britain, so on, all contributing by way of serious armed forces, then it really was a question mark about whether really NATO made any sense at all. And Walter George was one of those people. Harry Truman wanted to send $1 billion of military aid to NATO at the end of 1949. Walter George was very unhappy about this. He thought America couldn't afford it. He was worried that the money would be wasted. He was worried that if you did rearm Europe and the Soviets invaded, all the Mongols would fall to Soviet hands. So that was the kind of person Water George was. And he's emblematic and important because he just shows you the extent to which Harry Truman had trouble with Congress. And he shows you, I think, a lot of the nuances and subtleties of attitudes at the time. There were many Democrats who, frankly, were more conservative than some Republicans. That was the situation that Harry Truman had to deal with. And finally, of course, Water George was a segregationist. Being a senator from Georgia, he firmly believed in segregation. He was determined to preserve it and continue it. He was what I call a silent segregationist in the sense he tried not to talk about the issue. And that was characteristic at the time. Many politicians wanted to maintain segregation. They were dead against any form of civil rights legislation, but they tried to avoid talking about it because they thought the less you talked about it, the less likely it would become an issue. And eventually, of course, it did become a huge issue. And men like Walter George were the kind of people who prevented it from being abolished maybe a lot earlier than it should have been.
It's going to become a huge issue, and it's going to become one of the major issues that's going to ultimately break that Democratic Party, and that's why you see that massive flip between the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960, and then the election of Richard Nixon later on in 1968. So those states are all going to flip. And you can go look at the electoral maps right now if you want to, but yeah, we don't talk about the Senate enough in the United States, and I don't particularly know why that is. I guess maybe it's just easier to talk about presidents because there's more of them. But I'm just going to throw out another name that some of the listeners may be familiar with, but he's in Congress right now. His name is Chuck Grassley. He's a Republican from Iowa. He's been there for, I believe, 47 years. That's a long time, folks. So if you want to talk about the concentration of power in some people's hands, like, we don't have term limits for senators, right? And we do for presidents. So yes, we do focus a lot on those. And it's also worth pointing out that, please, by all means, if you're listening to this, pull up the United States Constitution. The first article is Congress, because that was the most important from their perspective. And that also explains why a Congress that suffers periods of paralysis, which ours tends to now, is so problematic, because it hoists the responsibility for accomplishing tasks on the other two branches that really weren't intended to do it from their perspective, and that causes constitutional problems. Okay, but all this aside, that was just a little soapbox there, but all this aside, I want to talk about the nuclear weapons, because obviously the other shadow that is cast over the 1950s is the prospect of nuclear war and essentially nuclear annihilation. When did Truman find out that the Soviets had successfully tested a nuclear weapon? And obviously it changes the balance of power in Europe and around the world, but give us a sense for what we're talking about here, for what it means for the Soviets harnessing that power.
Well, I'll just say on the subject of term limits in Congress, before I talk about the atom bomb, of course, in Britain, we have this bizarre institution known as the House of Lords within Parliament. And as you know, in the House of Lords, there are more than 800 members of it. You can be appointed to the House of Lords at the age of 25 or 30, and you remain there till you die. So, we can't really talk. I think your problem actually is a bit less than ours. But on the subject of the atom bomb, well, now, as I was saying earlier, the Soviets had detonated their first atomic bomb test on August the 29th, 1949, just a few days before the book begins. Now, what happened was 2 or 3 days later, some of the radioactive dust from the explosion was picked up by an American B-29 bomber, which was flying over the sea to the north of Japan. Now, the news of that, or the readings from the radioactive monitor, were immediately transmitted to Washington by teleprinter. So the news immediately arrived in Washington. But of course, they didn't know yet whether or not it really was a Soviet atom bomb. It might simply have been dust from an explosion, for example, an accident in a Soviet nuclear reactor. Anyway, there followed a period of really intense activity lasting for several weeks. And altogether, 90 aircraft were sent up both by the US Air Force and by the Royal Air Force from Great Britain to monitor this radioactive dust cloud as it kind of drifted from Japan over Alaska, over Canada, over the Atlantic, and eventually over Great Britain. I think some of the dust actually ended up in Scotland. They had to analyze it very carefully. Now, it took a little while. Truman was told about this on about September the 10th, 5 days after Labor Day. But what he was told about was the fact that the tests were being conducted because there was no confirmation yet. About a week later, they got the confirmation through that it was definitely an atom bomb test. And the reason they were able to do that was because by analyzing the nature of the radioactivity, they could tell that it must have come from nuclear fission, which is what happens when you have an atom bomb goes off. And now Truman decided to tell the American people. And not everybody agreed in his administration about that he should actually make a public announcement. But Truman decided to do so, which he did on September the 23rd. And he did that, as far as I can see, for really three reasons. First of all, he was worried that there would be a leak, that somebody in the Pentagon or the Air Force or the scientific world would leak this to the press, and there would be a kind of sensation and a panic and so on. So Truman was worried about that. He was also worried that the Soviets might get there first with an announcement, and he wanted to make sure the Soviets didn't announce it in such a way that, it would become a propaganda coup for the Soviet Union. And thirdly, I think he just felt the American people ought to know. So he made this announcement on December 23rd. The strange thing is that the announcement didn't actually cause a panic. And I think the reason it didn't cause a panic in the nation was because for years now it had been expected that at some point the Soviets would get the atom bomb, because the Soviets had been dropping heavy hints about it. In 1947, their foreign minister, Molotov, had already more or less said that they had the science, which they probably did at that stage. So it didn't cause a terrible panic. What it did do was it caused a lot of consequences inside the government and inside the military establishment in Washington, and those turned out to be quite fateful. And you might ask me what they were.
Yeah, well, let's tug on that thread a little bit, because I do want to know. I mean, America essentially has this, this ace in the hole because they have this huge advantage with this weapon, and obviously this is going to result in military changes. So, what happened within the Pentagon as a result?
Well, the Soviets had got the bomb probably about 2 or 3 years earlier than the Americans had been expecting. The scientists in the US had thought it would take them until maybe about 1952 or 53 to actually get the bomb. Now, in terms of the military balance of power, the acquisition of the bomb by the Soviet Union didn't actually make an immediate great difference, because they didn't have an aircraft which would be capable of delivering it to the United States. They wouldn't have that for some years to come. In addition, they didn't have missiles, for example. They did not yet have the intercontinental ballistic missiles that became such an issue in the mid to late 1950s. They didn't have that. So it didn't make an enormous difference to the balance of military power immediately, but it was clear that it was going to at some stage in the not-too-distant future. By the mid-50s, there was going to be a big issue. Now, the most important effect in the near term in the United States of the announcement of the Soviet bomb was the issue of the hydrogen bomb. Now, I'm sure many people have seen the film Oppenheimer, which appeared a few months ago, and it's really an excellent film, actually. I mean, given how difficult it is to put history on the screen, on the cinema screen, I think that does a fantastic job of it. And much of what the film says is entirely accurate. The problem was that it had been known for some time, from a theoretical point of view, that it ought to be possible to create a new kind of weapon, the hydrogen bomb, based on thermonuclear fusion. That had been known in principle since about 1941 or 42. The science was there. It wasn't at all clear whether it was actually practically feasible, how it would be done, and how it would work, and how dangerous and so on it would be. But it was known that work could be done. And so the immediate impact of the Soviet bomb test was to generate a huge wave of pressure and support within national security circles in Washington, within the Pentagon, within Congress, to get the hydrogen bomb built by the United States before the Russians did. And that's essentially what happened. There was one particular individual, well, two particular individuals. One was Lewis Strauss, who is portrayed in the film, in the Oppenheimer film, who was a member of the Atomic Energy Commission. He pushed very heavily for the building of the hydrogen bomb. There was another man called Senator Brian McMahon, another senator, very interesting senator, Senator Brian McMahon, who was a leading Democrat. He was somebody who actually, if he hadn't died, he died just very young, a couple of years later. If he had not died, he might actually have been the Democratic candidate for president in 1952 instead of Adlai Stevenson. And history might have been different, actually. But McMahon was very, very keen to push for the building of the hydrogen bomb. And they gathered around them a great deal of support in Congress. They had support in the military as well, where the Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to build the hydrogen bomb. And so a kind of unstoppable momentum built up, which meant that in the end of January 1950, when Harry Truman had to make a decision on this issue, there was really no decision that Harry Truman could take other than to go ahead with the research and the development, build the H-bomb, which of course eventually was tested at the end of 1952, and then tested much more thoroughly and in a usable form in 1954 with a huge test at Bikini Atoll. It became enormously controversial around the world. So the hydrogen bomb development program was really kind of flowed from what was happening with the Soviet bomb in the fall of 1949.
And that's sort of it's interesting because, you know, the Soviets get the atomic bomb. The pressure then becomes to get a more powerful weapon, which is the hydrogen bomb. And that plays into my next question, because it becomes clear at some point, and I think you write in the book, no one expected Harry Truman to win the Cold War at a stroke, which is another way of sort of saying that, like, this was clearly going to be a long-term conflict. And you can see this developing later on. So I had two questions about that. One was, okay, so if this is going to be a long-term conflict, what was the strategy that was being talked about as we start to focus in on Truman's administration in the early 1950s? And two, did people understand, and I'm going to use that term broadly, you know, both within the administration and then, you know, maybe even regular Americans, people understand that this was going to be this long-term struggle that could drag on for decades?
Well, they certainly understood that, yes. There were many observers who predicted this would be a long struggle that would go on for decades. But nevertheless, the Cold War was really in very much its early stages, and a lot of thinking about issues of national security and so on was in its very early stages. So it was kind of unformed, it was a bit kind of inchoate. It really hadn't sort of congealed together. Now, you can argue about the date when the Cold War began, and there's a lot of argument about that. But one key date, obviously, was the Truman Doctrine speech, which he gave to Congress in the spring of 1947. And the point about that speech was essentially what he was saying was that America would stand alongside and support any country that was resisting aggression from outside, which essentially meant aggression from the Soviet Union or its allies. Now, the Truman Doctrine, you can see, is kind of one of the founding moments of the Cold War, but it was a doctrine, it wasn't actually a strategy. The key word in terms of strategy is containment. Now, the word containment, which will forever be associated with the American diplomat and historian and thinker George Kennan, who was talking about containment in 1946 and 1947. The idea of containing the Soviet Union, of preventing the Soviet Union from spilling over out of its borders and projecting its power all across the globe. Now, the problem with containment, and containment was at the heart of the strategy of Harry Truman towards the Cold War, the problem is, what does it mean? The word containment is the key word, but it can, in practical terms, it can have lots of different kinds of interpretations, and it can mean all sorts of different things. One possibility for containment was what they call perimeter defense, where essentially you put armed forces all the way around the borders of the Soviet Union and Russia as you hem them in so they can't escape outside their borders. Well, that's not really practical. In fact, it was totally impractical with the resources available. Another possibility was called what they call sort of hub or strong point containment, where what you do is you defend the really important places. Good example, the German Ruhr, for example, because the German Ruhr was a great war-making complex of West Germany, certainly under Hitler, and then it was terribly important still after World War II. You defend things like that, or you defend places like Japan, because Japan is so important strategically. So that's another form of containment. Another form of containment is cultural containment, is doing your absolute best to present America's way of life and to present the British way of life, say the democratic way of life, as being the ideal way of life, the way of life that everybody should aspire to. So there are all kinds of things that containment could mean. And containment was something that had to be debated endlessly. Really only in the mid-50s, really under Dwight D. Eisenhower, the kind of Cold War strategy really settled down into its definite form that would be maintained right up until the collapse of the Soviet Union in the mid-1980s. And also, of course, the problem was that whatever Harry Truman or Dean Acheson or Dwight D. Eisenhower thought about containment, the Russians had ideas of their own. And one of the great problems of this period was the fact that Stalin was a lot more flexible than people gave him credit for. Now, Stalin, absolutely fascinating character, a central character in my book, a central character in many books, a character, difficult to interpret, but absolutely the person you have to get to grips with. And Stalin had one particular characteristic, which I think was a real problem for everybody, which was that he was, in terms of his ideology, his political views, they were always fixed. He was always a Marxist-Leninist. But in terms of his strategy and tactics from month to month, from year to year, he was prepared to be very flexible and make U-turns. And that's what he essentially did when he authorized the invasion of Korea in June 1950. 1949, He did not want Kim Il-sung from North Korea to invade the South. Suddenly changed his mind in January 1950 and gives the go-ahead for Kim Il-sung to invade the South. And that was the problem with Stalin. Stalin was a man who was prepared to change. He was make U-turns. He was strategically very, very flexible, very devious. And that was one of the reasons which made Stalin such a kind of formidable competitor and a formidable opponent.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out here that, while we kind of retroactively look back on this period, and again, this is another maybe some characteristic of America that, we see America as, oh, it's the superpower. It's always been a superpower in the world. But that's not actually historically accurate, in terms of when we go back and we think about, well, no, I mean, we did. I honestly have had people in the past say, well, we won independence from the British and we're immediately the great superpower of the world. And it's like, no, not at all. That's not true. But so this was new. This was new for the people in the Truman administration, sort of thinking about, because you talk about like, well, what does containment mean? And these were questions that they had to grapple with in terms of, okay, well, how are we going to contain the Soviet Union? And yeah, it doesn't settle into its sort of permanent characteristics until later. Like this was an era where there was very much a debate about how to do these sorts of things. And I think it's really important. And I wish it was a part of history that was talked about a little bit more. Or we're coming up on time, but I did want to ask one last question because I didn't know very much about this. And I thought it was a really interesting part of the book. Everybody's heard of the B-29 bombers, but there's this controversy over the B-36, that you talk about in the book, because the other thing that's going on in the 1950s in the United States, something that Eisenhower will sort of famously talk about, is these growing concerns over the rise of what we call the military industrial complex, and the changing nature of warfare, and of how we come up with new weapons. Because, we talked about the need to create the hydrogen bomb because the Russians get the atomic bomb. And then you need ways to distribute this firepower, ever changing ways. And so, but the B-36 was a really interesting story. And I thought it'd be a great way to end today if you could tell us a little bit about that and how it sort of plays into those two aspects.
The B-36 bomber was the bomber that would eventually be superseded a few years later by the B-52. The B-52, which is still with us and still, an important part of America's arsenal, and obviously very famous for its role in Vietnam and so on. Now, the B-36 was a lumbering monstrosity of an airplane. It wasn't a jet. It was powered by 6 great big piston engines, and it had the longest wingspan of any combat aircraft ever built, before or since. Huge thing. It had an enormous range. It could fly 10,000 miles, and that was the important thing about it, which was the fact that it was intended to be the primary mechanism for delivering the atom bomb against the Soviet Union, or maybe one day China. So it was the core of America's strategic nuclear defense, or in other words, Strategic Air Command, as it was known. Trouble with the B-36 was that it, as I say, it was a lumbering monstrosity of an aircraft. It was slow, it was cumbersome, and the reality is it was never used in action. It couldn't have been used in action because if it had been used in action, it would have been shot down by the Soviets almost immediately. The Soviets already had a fighter called the MiG-15, which they were testing in 1949 and 1950, which is just about to enter service, and the MiG-15 would have shot the B-36 out of the sky almost immediately. So the B-36 was a bit useless, actually. In fact, people used to call it a lemon, but it had been enormously expensive, and the controversy about it in the fall of 1949 was a huge feud in public between the United States Navy and the United States Air Force. Now, and it wasn't just the kind of usual inter-service rivalry that you get in the Pentagon. It was a really serious argument. The point was this: the United States Navy believed in the aircraft carrier. Because of what had happened in World War II, because of the Battle of Midway, because of the other great battles of World War II, because of the role of the aircraft carriers in the defeat of Japan, the United States Navy believed in the aircraft carrier as a huge and almost the primary mechanism for projecting American power around the world. The Air Force, of course, didn't believe in the aircraft carrier. The aircraft believed in the B-36 and one day the B-52 of Strategic Air Command based in Omaha, Nebraska, and so on. They believed that was the essential, the core component of America's defensive arsenal. And the two clashed in public in the fall of 1949, and very public indeed. Various admirals, the head of the U.S. Navy, chief of naval operations, a guy called Admiral Denfield, actually ended up getting fired for this by Truman early the following year. Basically, the argument on the part of the Navy was, well, if you rely entirely on aircraft like B-36 and on the atom bombs they carry, first of all, you may make atomic warfare more likely. You're going to make yourself very inflexible. You're going to be overcommitted to that arm, and you're going to leave the way open for the Soviets to do all kinds of things which you didn't want to respond to with atom bombs, and they'll be free to kind of take over parts of the world because you haven't got aircraft carriers, so you can send the Air Force, the Navy off to meet them. The Air Force, on the other hand, said, well, yes, but we've got to have these aircraft because the Soviets are going to get them. And also the Air Force pointed out, well, actually, it's cheaper. The argument on part of the Air Force was that having a defense based on great big strategic bombers carrying atom bombs will end up being a lot cheaper in terms of the federal budget than having huge conventional forces, Navy and Army and so on. And that argument, of course, was designed to appeal to people like the fiscal conservatives in Congress, people like Walter George, who we mentioned earlier, who were fiscal conservatives, who didn't want to spend too much on the armed forces, and therefore they were much more interested in having an expensive but not as expensive Air Force, an Air Force not as expensive as the Navy and the Army, because that would be the economical way of running America's defense. And this argument at B-36 was very public, but it had one very important impact politically and historically, and it had to do with President Eisenhower, or the future President Eisenhower, because now Eisenhower at this point in 1949 was out of military service. He was still a general, because of course you can't retire. You're always, once a general, you're always a general in America. He was still a general. But he was actually president of Columbia University in New York. But what they would do is they would summon him back to Washington whenever there was a problem to try and help out and try and smooth things over and come up with a solution. And so he was involved in Congress and giving testimony at the time of these hearings during this great big feud between the Army and the Navy. And one of the things that happened was that Eisenhower became at this period more and more exasperated with the Truman administration. He was more and more unhappy with the way the Truman administration was treating the armed forces. He was more and more unhappy with the budget limitations they were putting on them. He was more and more unhappy with what he saw as the damage to military and naval morale that's occurring during this great big row between the Navy and the Air Force. So this was one of the periods in which Eisenhower started to think seriously about becoming or running for president in 1952. He was gradually inching towards that decision. And at this period, and then again the period leading up to and during the Korean War, early stage of the Korean War, was when he really kind of clinched his view that he should run for president at some stage. Wouldn't decide for a long time yet, in a definitive way, but during this situation in the fall of 1949, he was entering into that period of kind of preparation for becoming a presidential candidate.
Well, and it's fascinating the way that sometimes what looks like a relatively small aspect of history turns into something enormous, because Eisenhower's presidency is obviously going to usher in watershed moments of its own. It'd be the first time a Republican had seized control of the presidency in decades. So, and the fact that, and the other thing that is worth pointing out here is, again, it all kind of comes back to this idea of how important Congress is and the changing nature of all of that, because Congress sets the budget and Congress is the one that decides what gets made. And of course, another aspect that every congressman and senator is going to think about is, well, where is this getting made? Is this getting made in my district? Is part of this going to help me out? And those are questions that don't necessarily have immediate military strategic implications. And that's important as well. But, well, this has been great. It's been a wonderful interview. We have barely scratched the surface of the book. I don't think we made it past 1954 at any point, and barely even talked about that. So there's obviously worlds more. We only hardly mentioned favorite senator from my home state of Wisconsin, Joseph McCarthy, is an interesting character in and of himself. And, there's just a lot more to do here. So I hope people pick up the book, but thank you so much for the talk. It's been illuminating.